So I hate to interrupt these incredible conversations that have been happening over the last 2 days. We'll say 2 days. So my name is Mary Oken. I am the Assistant Director of the Living New Deal, and this is the final portion of our 2.5-day convening called Forgotten Federal Art Legacies, PWAP to CETA. And this afternoon is really focused on the artist's perspective. So I'm going to go through a series of acknowledgements. First of all, Forgotten Federal Art Legacies coincides with the 90th anniversary of the Federal Art Project managed under the Works Progress Administration, the 50th anniversary of the first CETA Arts projects, 1975, developed in San Francisco, the recent founding of the Critical Ethnic Studies minor at the California College of the Arts, and the spring 2025 CES student projects, which include campus gardens with native plants and mural painting on CCA's main building, all informed by the students' study of public art history, faculty-guided research, and co-learning with the Association of the Ramaytush Alone. This event is co-hosted by the Living New Deal, my organization, in partnership with the California College of the Arts, San Francisco Bay Area institutions that operate in Hoichen and Yalamo, also known as the cities of Berkeley, Oakland, and San Francisco, on the unceded territories of the Chochenyo and Ramaytush Alone peoples. And we thank the opportunity to be here. Acknowledgements as well. This event is co-organized by me and Jackie Francis, who is not, she was running off to do a quick errand, but who is absolutely wonderful, and I'm so grateful to work with on this event. Jackie is the Dean of Humanities and Sciences Division at the California College of the Arts. This event is also supported by the generosity of donors to Living New Deal's Advocating for New Deal Art initiative. If you were here yesterday, you heard a little bit more about that, and by donors to the California College of the Arts, as well as the Terra Foundation for American Art Convening Grants Program and the California Humanities Quick Grants Program. The Terra Foundation for American Art was established in 1978 and has offices in Chicago and Paris. Terra supports organizations and individuals locally and globally with the aim of fostering intercultural dialogues and encouraging transformative practices that expand narratives of American art through the Foundation's grant program, collection, and initiatives. Visit www.terraamericanart.org. We also thank California Humanities, a partner of the NEH. Visit calhum.org. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this convening do not necessarily represent those of California Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities. Disclaimers finished. The convening agenda for to this afternoon, or today, we've done an incredible tour with the Executive Director of CETA Eyes, Susan Cervantes, who's here with us today. Thank you, Susan, again for this phenomenal tour of CETA Eyes and the murals in the Mission District. It was wonderful. Today, we're going to have a lunchtime roundtable with some folks that I've gotten to know through the Art Initiative and the work I've gotten to do for Living New Deal. We're going to be talking about the San Francisco CETA history from one of its originators and the CETA Arts Legacy Project. So I'll introduce Virginia and Blaise, and Virginia and Blaise will introduce John Kreidler. So Virginia and Blaise are both artists. Blaise is a photographer, Virginia is a sculptor and feminist artist, and they are the co-founders of the CETA Arts Legacy Project, which recovers the history of CETA and advocates for recognition and community building and scholarship on this really important legacy of the New Deal and legacy of the community spirit of the 70s. So I will let them take it away. Thank you so much and enjoy.
All right, we're going to introduce John when he's ready to come up and sit, which will be a little while. We were asked by Mary to present this afternoon because we were two artists in the project, and we had a wonderful experience working for 2 years in New York City as full-time CETA artists under the Cultural Council Foundation project. It was a fabulous time for us. We had just gotten out of graduate school at UC San Diego, in fact, and moved back home to New York, trying to figure out what we were going to do to make a living. And in October of 1977, we discovered through the newspapers in New York, we actually discovered it through the Daily News, not the Times, because working class families in New York read the Daily News. But it was also in the Times that there was going to be this big artists' employment project in New York City. And so we looked into it and we applied. And luckily for us, the timing was good because since we had been graduate students, we hadn't earned any money at all that year. So we qualified for the financial cutoff of the project. And like most CETA Arts projects, we also had to, besides meet those criteria, we had to be interviewed. We had to show our CV and all that as though we were getting a real job. And we had to be interviewed by a panel of experts. And then we were ranked. And Virginia and I were lucky enough to be 2 of the 300 artists hired out of about 3,000 people who applied. And these were not just visual artists, they were also musicians, performers, writers, poets, media artists, and dancers, right? So this was a very comprehensive project. Now, just as a reminder, we're going to be talking to John about what went on here in San Francisco starting in 74, 75. That was at the beginning of the arc of CETA employment of artists. And these guys were incredibly inventive and figured out how to build things and how to make it all work. The people who put our project together in 1977 had that as a model to work from. And they also had projects all over the country, including Washington, D.C. They had the big 5.5-inch binder that you might remember having heard about. That was kind of a step-by-step playbook for how to create a CETA project. So they designed, with the help of some really good people like Ted Berger and McClenny.
Cheryl McClenny.
Cheryl McClenny, who was the
Assistant Commissioner of Cultural Affairs in
New York City. They designed this project in a really, really smart way. And so here we are on our very first day, Fashion Institute of Technology's auditorium, and we're being initiated into this project. Just to give you a sense of the fact that this was both citywide and national in scope, on your left is Henry Geldseller, who was at that time the brand new Commissioner of Cultural Affairs of New York City. He had been the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art prior to that. And next to him, Rochelle Slovin, who was the director of the project. In the right-hand photo on the left is Sarah Gerritsen, who was the director of CCF, Cultural Council Foundation, which was a nonprofit that provided administrative services to nonprofit art groups. And in order to take on CETA, they doubled in size. They had to hire a lot of people and really learn how to, manage a program with 300 people. And on the right is Livingston Biddle, who came down from D.C., right? And he was...
Came up from D.C.
I'm sorry, came up from D.C. to be there on that first day. I want to show this one in particular. This was the second day, but immediately the CETA CCF administrators wanted us to know there was a connection to the New Deal. All right, and in fact, they were very open about having done a lot of their thinking based on New Deal art projects. So on the left, you see a guy who was a New Deal artist, Elton Fax, who I believe the Living New Deal has actually included in one of their videos. Next to him is Francis V. O'Connor, pretty famous as a scholar of the New Deal. And then the two guys on the right who were in our project had also been in the WPA. And that's Herman Cherry and Joseph Delaney, the brother of Beaufort Delaney on the right. And this is just a picture in their studios by my colleague, George Malave. So what did CETA artists do? Well, we're going to use Virginia as a model because she had a lot of different community assignments.
So you get to see what I looked like back then.
And these are my photographs because I was on the documentation unit. So I was sent out to document my life at work. This is an after-school center in the Bronx that Virginia worked at.
There was something the project had to be very careful about. If we taught children, we couldn't do it as part of a regular school day because we couldn't conflict with the teachers' union. So it was always after school or some sort of special project that we would do. So a lot of them were after-school programs.
Virginia's in another school center, this one in in Brooklyn, and she's invited a CETA dancer to come and help students do some figurative drawing based on position. That's Virginia in the white t-shirt. Here she is in another after-school center back in the Bronx. These were 3-month assignments, typically, right? And they could be renewed. And one of the reasons, well, I'll come back to that in a minute. This is Virginia at yet another assignment at the James Monroe Public Housing Project in the Bronx. They wanted a tile mural. So Virginia's in the process of getting the tiles ready that were going to be painted by the students. Another assignment was with the Brooklyn Arts and Culture Association, and they had just been given use of a former Catholic school in downtown Brooklyn that had closed as a school, and the idea was this was going to be converted into a multi-purpose cultural center in Brooklyn, and that's Virginia in the middle.
It eventually became known as Baca Downtown, and people like Spike Lee did projects there. Danny DeVito, I found out, did stand-up stuff there. Susan Laurie Parks, the playwright, she got her start there. So Baca Downtown went for many years, but a group of CETA artists, us here, we literally started it. We stripped paint. We painted, we built the stage, we waxed floors, we did everything. And then we did artwork in it. There were murals and various other artworks.
So that's Virginia with another artist, Richard Nixick, going over the floor plans of the building. This is yet another assignment. Virginia was put with the New York Botanical Gardens up in the Bronx again, and one of the things they had her do was do illustrative drawings of their historical microscope collection.
Right. They didn't just want photographs, they wanted drawings with the measurements. So I spent 3 months drawing these.
And then they brought her on for another 3 months. I guess she was a good artist. And they gave her a commission to create a sculpture for the children's plant garden. And so Virginia made this sculpture with 3-dimensional representations of various plants and vegetables.
They're cast concrete bricks, and they would actually be put in the planting beds. And the thing is, blind kids could feel it. Seeing kids could do rubbings of them.
Mm-hmm. And then on a similar vein, this, like a lot of the projects, we worked in community settings 4 days a week, and we worked in our own studio 1 day a week. And we owned our work, and we had shared copyright of the work with the Cultural Council Foundation. So it was a pretty enlightened approach.
I often say the 1 day in a week in our studio, they actually sent inspectors around. It was kind of like communist China used to send inspectors in artist studios, but we weren't being judged on content. We were just being judged on, are you doing any work?
Mm-hmm. So this was the documentation unit. That's me. You saw this photo yesterday in Molly and Jody's presentation. George Malave on the far left made some of the photographs I'm showing you. Sarah Wells was the third photographer on the far right. She made some of the photographs and unfortunately died very young. Judd Tully, who was also mentioned as a writer, is the tall guy in the middle. So one of the purposes for our photographs and our writing was this internal journal called Journal. And it was distributed internally, but also externally. It was sent to borough presidents' offices. It was sent to arts organizations. It was sent around because the CCF people knew they had to promote this thing. They knew they had to get people on board. They had to get people appreciating it. They had to counter a lot of counter and negative propaganda about the program. So right from the beginning, they began to put out, their own propaganda. That's my photo on the cover. This is issue 1/1. We were technically reporting to a group called the Foundation for the Community of Artists.
The documentation team was.
The 7 of us. They had started out as the Art Workers Coalition in New York, and they had evolved into the Foundation for the Community of Artists. They put out a monthly newspaper called Art Workers News, and part of the agreement was they would turn over a portion of the content to the CETA Project every month.
So that's a photograph by Nina Kuo, right?
Mm-hmm. One of our photographers. And you saw this yesterday also. They also put out another little publication called Payday News every 2 weeks, which had very specific things about the project, what was happening, what some of the successes were, what were some things to watch out for. And we received that at a bi-weekly session where we received our paychecks.
And something I wanted to stress about this, I think maybe it was Molly and Jody, you talked about Payday and how we formed communities of artists. But we formed those communities not just then, we're still friends with a lot of these people. We made these connections and across disciplines that, I might never have met the poet Bob Holman, but we're still friends after all these years.
Mm-hmm. And they also used our photographs on posters and advertisements for shows. They organized exhibitions as part of their project. So again, they knew they had to get work out into the public. And they did probably about 24 or so really good exhibitions during the 2 years that we were part of the project. These are the administrators, the photo by George Malave. And I just wanted to put this up. The administrators were also, for the most part, artists. And again, from all the different kinds of fields that were represented. And part of what made the project work really well was they hired a really good administrative staff. And these were the people who would go out to the community organizations and talk to them about whether they wanted an artist and explain what that would entail. Explain it wouldn't include materials, as you heard Susan say this morning. So they had to commit to providing materials. They were told what they could expect and not expect.
And they also ran interference when either an artist didn't do what he or she was supposed to do, or the community sponsor didn't fulfill its obligation. So they would figure it out. They would be the go-betweens.
I'm looking for Liz Thompson. She's not in this photo. All right. But way down on the lower left, the woman with the shells in her hair is Blondell Cummings, a dancer who went on to a lot of fame and actually had a big show at the Getty Center 2 years ago. And they did a book about her, a beautiful book about her, which has 3 of my photographs in it. So having been a documentary photographer has paid off to me to some extent. Joan Mondale was shown yesterday. She was known colloquially among our group as Joan of Art. And that's Charlene Baca in the big glasses who ran the Brooklyn Arts and Culture Association, talking to one of our artists, Susan Scher. Mayor Edward Koch, a very iconic figure coming to look at the art.
Right in front of one of my drawings.
Yes. A show in New York City Hall. And this guy, you saw this photo in a little version yesterday, Ernie Green, the assistant director, Molly? Assistant Secretary of the Department of Labor, who was a big fan of the arts and a big fan of CETA Arts, and helped put together that 5.5-inch binder and traveled around the country doing a certain amount of promotion. Our people knew he was very important and supportive, so we sent Judd Tully down to DC to interview him. And Judd took a pretty good picture, even though he was the writer and not the photographer. Mark Levin headed the media group, Foundation of Independent Video and Film Producers. This is Mark at a town hall meeting. And I just want to give a shout out to Mark because he's continued to produce a lot of interesting work. Most recently, he put out a film called It's Basic, which is about guaranteed basic income. And it's worth looking up. I think it's available, not on YouTube, but on Vimeo. And he's also working to do a piece about Creatives Rebuild New York, the big Mellon-founded employment project. So we had an orchestra, about a 30-piece orchestra called the Orchestra of New York. Here we are performing in Battery Park. We had 2 different jazz bands, a big jazz band and a small jazz band. We had about 7 or 8 dance ensembles that were involved because their directors were part of the project. Vic Stornant, in this case. We had more writers than this, but this particular group of writers collectively formed a group called Words to Go and got a hold of a van and painted it, and they would go like a SWAT team to a school and run workshops on poetry. That's Bob Holman in the middle with the sunglasses. This is one of the big shows that was organized at the Snug Harbor Cultural Center on Staten Island. And this is the making of the poster for that show. These were hand-pulled silk screens done by one of our artists, Wendy Tiefenbacher.
And recently, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, we were at an exhibition in that space, and we spoke to the director of Snug Harbor Newhouse Gallery. She knew nothing about CETA, didn't know about the shows. We showed her pictures.
She said, well, I guess it happened. But Ursula von Ratingsvard, you may know, one of the preeminent sculptors in the United States, was in our project. I got to go to her studio in Soho and photograph her. Brenda Ashley, just her little storefront studio in Brooklyn. Selvin Goldburn, who was a decorated Vietnam War hero, who was one of our administrators and also liked to sketch people at street fairs, such as this one in Harlem. Charles Stanley doing a mural project in a school. A dancer, Naz Hosseini, doing a motion movement project in the Jamaica Public Library. Molly, you mentioned xerography yesterday. This is Bud Wirtschafter, a filmmaker who also ran a copy shop in Soho. He had the first color Xerox machine available to artists. So he was a very popular guy. Ellsworth Osby, a painter, studio in Brooklyn. I got to photograph him. I got to photograph a rehearsal going on in his studio that involved our dancers and jazz musicians. And I got to photograph the performance that came out of that in Union Square that summer. This photo and another one like it ended up in the Alvin Ailey show at the Whitney, by the way. So I am doing very well based on my CETA work.
And we were able to inform the curator that the Alvin Ailey Dance Company got CETA funding as well.
This is one of those demonstrations that Molly and Jody referred to. This was a general demonstration, all CETA workers. I'll just mention, CETA workers were 20,000 people out of about 1 million.
Artists, CETA artists.
CETA artists were about 20,000 out of 1 million people employed by CETA. So we were about 2%, right? So this was a general CETA protest to look for re-upping the project for a second year. And this was a CETA Artists Organization protest in the early 1980 when the project was already coming to a close. And I'll let Virginia describe.
Oh, well, I can't remember. Somebody showed a photo of Marion Greenwood in their presentation, but she was from the back. But I found this interesting because here's Marion Greenwood from the WPA standing next to her mural. And this is Blaise's photo of Alan Samelin in the New York project. But Blaise didn't know about the composition of the Marion photo, but they're almost identical.
Mm-hmm. So we didn't do a lot of public artworks. We were mostly about community service of various sorts, but we did some. And this one was in the Queen's Hall of Science, actually. This one was very beautiful. It was done for the World Trade Center. It hung over the entrance to the PATH trains for many years until a bombing happened in 1993. that destroyed this mural.
Right. It was called Commuter Landscape by Cynthia Mailman.
And then in the 2001 bombing, 4 other CETA murals in the World Trade Center were destroyed, and those were our major murals. So we lost a lot of our public work. So again, CCF was all about being sure that people knew the work that they were doing and we were doing. And at the end of the project, they put out what we could call kind of a yearbook that talked about the project. And it was in that very book, John, that we first saw your name. There's an article in there about the history of CETA. And we had no idea we would ever meet this guy. So we were really happy to eventually meet him. Okay, so John, your turn to come up.
So that's what John looked like a long time ago.
I've said this. I've said this a number of times. My wife refers to this as my days as Captain Sideburns.
But this is from the movie made by the group Optic Nerve in 75,
Yes.
right? About the project. And you can find that at various places online. You can look up Optic Nerve and find it, or you can go to our website.
Yeah, it's
which
on
will
a
tell you
site
that.
called California Revealed.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So anyway, John, the movie, Optic Nerves.
So are you gonna, well, I don't know, do you need an
Oh, I need to
introduction?
introduce John. Okay.
Yes.
Well, there's a picture of John. John is known affectionately as the godfather of CETA employment of artists. And he had arrived in San Francisco after spending 5 years in D.C. and kind of getting familiar with the legislation. And he and his wife came back driving a big truck and a car. And we won't go into the story.
Okay.
But
I appreciate that.
and he got an internship, I guess, with the Arts Commission, right, among other things, and wrote a proposal that said, you know, this CETA money, we can make it work to hire artists, essentially, right? And then he went on to do various things that help promote the idea of CETA Arts, although he, at one point, moved to Alameda, right, and became head of the Alameda Neighborhood Arts Project. So,
So you tell me when to
so anyway, if you want to just elaborate a little bit, maybe, John, about your background that prepared you for this, you know, task, and how you were situated in the San Francisco governmental arts structure, you know, that really put you in the right place to be able to come up with this idea.
Well, what's most appropriate to say here, because this is a production of the Living New Deal, is that early on in my graduate work at Berkeley, this was in 1967, 68, I got some advice from a professor, a man named Albert Leposky, who had been part of the New Deal administration of Franklin Roosevelt. And he said, why don't you write your master's thesis about the WPA arts projects, or more globally, the New Deal arts projects, not just the WPA. And he knew I had an interest in public policy and culture, and so I spent a few months working on that. There were no books written at the time about the WPA as a component of New Deal policy. But I was interested in more than anything in what the policy implications of all of this were for everyday people. I come from a family, I don't go into this very often, but I am descended from people who were circus artists and who were stage artists, performers. And it was always part of my schooling growing up here in California to make art and crafts. And those things were important to me. And I had a sense back then that all of this, that cultural expression by individuals, but especially by groups of people, church choruses, I think, are a fantastic example of this, how that can really mold people to be able to do other things besides just the singing that they do together. They become close friends, they get married, They carry on important things during catastrophes, whatever. But this whole notion that culture, especially when done in a social circumstance, that it can be a driving element of making a community of people that can get things done when they need to be done. And so that's what I was trying to understand from the WPA research I was doing. And I won't go too far down this road, but I want to mention one thing very quickly, that the part of it that most impressed me was not that it had literally employed a generation of artists, especially in places like New York City, and a lot in San Francisco too. But it had also, along the way, primarily in rural parts of the United States, it had created 111 community arts centers. And these really caught my attention. And especially I found, actually through the Living New Deal, some people who are scholars of this period of time and who were online, and I was listening in on all of this, these 111 centers, they brought it all back, and how much they had been in depressed places where there was really very little hope for an entire town. And they'd taken over former furniture companies or whatever on Main Street, hardware stores, and they converted it into community cultural centers. Some of them grew up to be things like the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, but most of these were in much, much smaller places than that. And it struck me that there was when I was writing my master's work at Cal, that there was a need to get government thinking about how that kind of logic could be reapplied, how in central cities as well as rural areas you could have places where artists were employed as teachers, as leaders, as examples of how people could themselves express cultural yearnings and desires, and in so doing come together. I'm going to jump way ahead. I spent the last 7 years of my career down in Silicon Valley working for a group called Cultural Initiative Silicon Valley. We did lots of public survey work. This is something I have actually not mentioned at all in recent times. A lot of it was done at San Jose State University. They have an excellent public survey department. And we were studying the extent to which people in Silicon Valley, and this was across the board, adults, so it wasn't aimed at the entire population, but adults of all races, of all genders, all of that, to what extent they saw themselves as having part of their lives devoted to the expression in art. And the numbers that came back were staggering of people of all income levels, by the way, how much they were involved in photography, in gardening, in drawing, in singing, ballroom dance. I mean, I could go write down a whole long list of all of this. And when you ask them about, I'll just take this one issue, because it became so important to me in the work that I was involved in down there. To what extent do you think that the arts should be taught in public schools? That was a question that was asked. 92% of the people surveyed said absolutely yes. So it wasn't all about just math and science and English, all of which is important to Silicon Valley, certainly. But there was, in a way, a kind of a correlation, because people were so much themselves involved in the amateur expression of arts as they saw it. They would describe themselves as amateur artists, that they had no problem saying, this ought to have, and now this, by the way, this was all being done in the early 2000s. And now California has passed an initiative to bring the 1% of all state funding of school curriculum is now going to be going into the arts once again. So we're back on a good arc in this. But that's behind, all of that is behind why I got interested in seeing the possibility of CETA used in San Francisco, was because I had that notion of the community, those 111 community arts centers, where they had transformed rural communities, and even up to the level of the Walker Art Center, and some of them still exist in the United States today. Interestingly enough, at the very time that I wound up here in San Francisco working for the San Francisco Neighborhood Arts Program, they were in the process of acquiring, using federal revenue sharing funds, general revenue, not CETA at all, but revenue sharing funds. They were acquiring 4 community art and cultural centers. Those centers exist today in the Mission District, in the Western Addition, the Bayview Opera House, and one that I hope we'll get around to, especially the South of Market Cultural Center, SOMAR, which has been so instrumental in propelling forward you might say, the day-to-day engagement of San Franciscans in culture in this town owes a lot to the South of Market Cultural Center and to the other centers as well.
So, John, we're going to move you on here because we got to cover a lot of territory. Okay, next one. Just very quickly, this is Eunice Elton. Right. We heard her name before. She was in the mayor's office of manpower. I imagine you had to work with her fairly closely.
Yeah, fairly closely and fairly briefly is the honest answer to that. As I said, I was hired as an intern to work for the San Francisco Neighborhood Arts Program in the summer of 1974. It quickly became apparent that this city was awash with not only a lot of unemployed artists, but a lot of infrastructure already to be able to put those artists into contact with the public, and which is not necessarily the same thing that the WPA and other New Deal programs were doing. Especially the Treasury section of the WPA was all about commissioning art to be done in public buildings, and it wasn't as though public involvement was necessarily involved in that, except if you're standing in line for postage stamps and you look up and you see the murals. But here, there was this whole movement of neighborhood arts. It struck me that it was very much in line with the 111 community centers that had been created under the WPA. And so I put together a proposal. I knew the CETA legislation very well. I knew the history of the WPA. And so this was sent forward to Eunice Elton, who is the director of the Mayor's Office of Education. And here, I don't know how many of you have been following the news, but recently we've been in a situation where planets have been in alignment, starting with Mercury on one end and ending up with Neptune on the other, or something like that. Well, the planets were in alignment in that the person who really had to be convinced that this was a good thing to do was this woman, Eunice Elton. She was the head of the Mayor's Office of Manpower, as it was then called. She knew the WPA history. She knew the Treasury history. And it didn't take any great treatise for her to accept the fact that there were plenty of artists who were unemployed who might be used in ways that were public service oriented, not just public art oriented, but public service oriented. So I've said this so many times that the Art Commission sent this proposal forward to her. I walked into her office. She said, "Okay, we're going to do this." It's not like there was any argument about it. It was just, let's do it. And so we were requesting 24 artists in all occupations, writers, choreographers, festival organizers, across the board, photographers. And that was all done. And then without me ever coming back to her or even the Art Commission, 24 artists were hired. There were 500 people who lined up for those jobs. And 4 weeks later, she came back to the Art Commission and she said, by the way, at that point, I was working in Alameda County. I wasn't even at the Art Commission anymore. And she said to the Art Commission, "Can you take another 90 positions on top of the 24? And they said, yes. Okay, so here's another 90. 3,000 people signed up for those applications. So the absolute pivotal planet in this was Eunice Elton.
Okay,
she stayed with it for years.
To move on to another, I think, fairly pivotal person.
Another planet.
Another planet.
Martin Snipper.
Yes.
Amazing. I've never seen this photograph. Well, Martin was a WPA artist. He was the head of the Art Commission. I didn't know that at the time I was putting this together. I had met him a few times, but we had a nice chat about the WPA, but not much. But it's not, again, a planet that just was perfectly lined up. It was nobody at the Art Commission who had to be convinced that this was a good idea. It also needs to be said, and this I think this is true of Martin and others. I'll leave Eunice aside. That for the most part in the arts community, there wasn't much thought that this was actually going to happen. That some interns around here is proposing CETA money for artists. Okay, well, if it happens, that's great, but we don't really expect much to come of it. So it was really Martin Snipper was instrumental, but Eunice Eldon, she made it happen.
And another person you give a lot of credit to.
Steve Goldstein later became the Dean of Graduate Studies at this school, at the California Academy of Arts. He was the head of the San Francisco Neighborhood Arts Program. He grew up here in San Francisco. He knew everybody in this town. As a kid, he had tried to get Ansel Adams to let him be a photography assistant. Ansel Adams said, "Why don't you talk to Imogen Cunningham?" So he called up Imogen Cunningham. She said, "Sure, come on over, Sonny." So for years, he was the darkroom assistant to Imogen Cunningham. Because of that, he met Ruth Ozawa, but he knew everybody in this town. He was the head of the San Francisco Neighborhood Arts Program. And again, that infrastructure was in place. The people who were community organizers in Chinatown, south of Market, wherever, they were already there. They knew how to use artists in public service positions. And to me, the people who are crucial to implementing this, as opposed to the people who are crucial for funding it, were Stephen Goldstein and Ruth Ozawa.
And let me just add, John, the photo on the right of Stephen as an older person was by Dawood Bey, very famous photographer, MacArthur Fellow, and one of our program's artists as well.
I'm so glad you pointed that out. Yeah, it's a great photograph, too.
Next one.
But Stephen was San Francisco's Encyclopedia of the Arts.
Anne-Marie Thielen, whose name has come up.
Right, we mentioned.
Yeah, Anne-Marie Thielen, I could go on about all these people, but she was an associate of Ruth Ozawa. Ruth Ozawa was, again, part of the planetary alignment here. She was on the Art Commission. So she was not only a well-known artist, but she was on the Art Commission. There are suddenly this 24 plus 90 positions. She said, fine, I'll take 40 of them. We'll put them into work in the schools. And within a matter of weeks, there were every school in San Francisco had a CETA artist in it as a result of Ruth Ozawa's program. Anne-Marie Thielen was one of her close associates. She goes back to the early days of the Alvarado School Art Project, which I presume many of you know, was a very important early model of arts education for the country, for that matter. And so those were all, they called themselves the moms. They all had kids at Alvarado, and a bunch of them then became principal people in the implementation of this. Anne Marie's job was for the positions that were allocated to the Art Commission. Ultimately, there were 200 of them, and then another 200 that went to nonprofit organizations. But the 200 that were under the Art Commission, she was the person who was the administrator for that.
So, John, I'm not going to stop on Elsa, other than to say she was the director of the Young Museum Art School, which was one of the early components of the project. Mm-hmm. And next one, Virginia. They also oversaw the fleet of trip-out trucks, which brought equipment and all kinds of things out to the community. But the next photo is of Ruth,
right?
And it's out by Imogen Cunningham.
By Imogen Cunningham.
Yeah. No, Ruth. Ruth certainly saw herself as being one of the early architects of this, and in her declining days, she asked me to write the University of California Press was doing a catalog of her work for an exhibition that was going to be at the Young Museum. She asked me to write a chapter of the biography that was there about what she called her CETA years. So the fact that she saw that as an important component of her life's work, I think it says a lot to me that she was not only the architect of what happened in the schools, but also community gardens in San Francisco. She always saw the gardens as being part of art, part of culture, agriculture. This goes back to her days at Black Mountain College.
That's why you were talking to the woman at CETA Eyes who was a CETA gardener.
Yeah,
right.
Got it.
Yeah.
But I mean, Ruth has been getting a lot of attention.
Certainly.
Luckily, the Whitney and here and on a U.S. postage stamp, so quite impressive.
Well, and now the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, in cooperation with the Museum of Modern Art in New York, is doing a whole thing on,
Next one.
on her as well.
Okay. These are the mujeres muralistas who we heard about from Susan this morning, so maybe we won't pause on this one. Go ahead, Ginny.
Pickle Family Circus.
Pickle Family. So my question related to Pickle Family, John, is slightly later phase of CETA, certain nonprofits were able to get direct funding, and Pickle Family was one of those. Do you want to just talk about that phase for a moment?
Actually, here's something I don't think that I've ever said to you, but is absolutely true. There was a way in which New York was very influential on what was happening at this phase because of the example of the cultural community, the CCF, which is
Cultural Council Foundation.
Thank you. I should know that. And their work in fiscal sponsorship of arts projects in New York was very well known out here. And Intersection for the Arts was early on an adopter of that model. But the Pickle Family Circus was not even a nonprofit corporation. They were under the fiscal sponsorship for their first year of the Alameda County Neighborhood Arts Program, my organization, and then eventually got their own 501c3 status, and were able to then get grants. But this was a very good example of, again, I want to give the credit here to the Mayor's Office of Manpower, because folks associated with that are able to walk into and deal with the staff of the Mayor's Office of and say, look, we're putting together this circus. We've got 3 key clowns, we've got acrobats, we've got jugglers, we've got administrators. How many prime sponsor agencies in the United States are going to even pay any attention to these people? Is it really interesting? But here, come on down. So this was an example of something that had it certainly outlasted CETA by at least a decade. The 3 principal clowns here are still all with us, fortunately, and have gone off to other careers.
I told you before I was going to ask you about René Yanez.
René was a cultural warrior, if there ever was one. He was one of the community organizers for the San Francisco Neighborhood Arts Program, but he was also the director of the Galleria de la Raza. And he had a very broad perspective. He certainly was providing early opportunities for exhibition and performance for a lot of Latino artists working out of the Galleria. But way beyond that, I mean, he early work done by a group called the Snake Theater, Chris Hardman and Laura Faribault. He had a broad perspective. Now, did he have much involvement with CETA? I think the Galleria probably had some people working for it. I can't say for a fact. I would be surprised if they didn't. But it was an example of a key institution in the Latino community of San Francisco that was able to capitalize during that period.
And I should say this is a poster by René, which I didn't mention. Okay, next one, Junior.
I didn't know that.
So, okay, Neighborhood Arts Program and Soma Arts come together in this photo.
Yep.
Just a couple of minutes about it, John, because we're running out of time.
What's very important is to look at the door here of this truck. This is a stage truck that's used to haul scaffolding for Susan Cervantes' murals were in part supported by this, but all manner of things were supported by these trucks, and the artists, including many CETA artists who were behind it. So they were experts in sound systems, lighting systems, security, putting up scaffolding, all that sort of thing. This is an old logging company that used to logging truck that used to belong to the Zellerbach Paper Company in Northern California. It was given by Harold Zellerbach, who is the chairman of the San Francisco Art Commission. It was given to the San Francisco Neighborhood Arts Program, which promptly painted a Viet Cong flag on the door. And subsequently, things were booming so much that Zellerbach later provided a brand new truck to the specifications of the Jack Davis and his crew, who were running this whole part of the neighborhood arts program, and that too had a Viet Cong flag painted on the side of it. So the South of Market Cultural Center, this building is a World War I era machine shop, massive internal space. It was filled with equipment. It had a print shop that was used for the kind of posters that you saw a moment ago that was attributed to Rene Yanez. It had all kinds of publicity help that was provided to local groups throughout San Francisco. So it was located in the South of Market area, but it wasn't really in a neighborhood the way the Mission Cultural Center was, or the Western Edition. It was really this outpost of technical aid that came to support community activity, festivals, parades, Cinco de Mayo, whatever, all through San Francisco, continues to this day to do that. If I could, no joke. If there was some way I could replicate, 1,000 of these across the United States, it would transform American culture.
Okay. On that note, Janya, you saw one of these from Mali yesterday. This was a show done by the San Francisco Arts Commission in 2018, in I guess the 50th anniversary of the program, and. John, I'm only putting that up there to ask you a different question, though. My question is, and these numbers came up again from Molly and Jody, there were about 400 positions overall that happened in San Francisco through CETA, and your estimate was maybe 2 artists per position over the length of time, so about 800 jobs, roughly.
About 800 people, 400 jobs that were filled over time.
But my question is,
3 times over. Yeah.
Did this experience do more than just give underemployed artists temporary work?
Well, yes, I think so, and because it was connecting them to communities, and CETA Eyes is a perfect example of that. It continues to provide an outlet for Susan Cervantes and other people associated with her to do work with the schools, to do work with the Public Recreation Department with the swimming pool that we saw today. It tended to do that. All that said, it's also the truth. I mean, one has to be honest and sort of direct about it wasn't for everyone. And I've heard both of you talk about that at times too. I mean, there were people who came into this and it just the idea of having a regular job and having supervision was for whatever reason beyond them. But mostly those people were screened out of this process, because when you were engaged to work for CETA through the San Francisco Neighborhood Arts Program in particular, basically you had to have a story about how you thought you could interact with this community and how you could serve it. And actually most people couldn't do that. Most artists couldn't do that. And so the ones who ended up being hired were in effect the cream of the crop, not necessarily based on their artistic credentials, but more on the fact that they had a vision of how they might be of service to the community. Some of them had already had years of practicing that anyway.
Okay, we're going to now just take a couple of minutes to talk about the CETA Arts Legacy Project.
All right, I'm going to be fast. I apologize that we started late, but it's all interesting. All right. So what is the CETA Arts Legacy Project? Who are we? What do we do? We're a group of former CETA artists and administrators, historians, and cultural activists who want to preserve the history of this federal program and who want to advocate it as a model for the future. A number of us former CETA artists from the project in New York have remained lifelong friends, like I've mentioned. We did a big push on the 10th anniversary of our project to keep its memory alive by getting that newspaper, Art Workers News, which had been renamed Art and Artists, to devote an entire issue to it. But as the years passed, every time we encountered another anniversary, we'd try to get something going, and nothing happened. until 2016. Actually, Bob Holman, the poet, did something a little bit earlier at his poetry club. But in 2016, a group of us began going to the New York City Municipal Archives to go through the boxes that we knew were in their collection, because Blaise was on the documentation team and the other photographer, George, remember having to turn in photos and contact sheets. So we knew something was in the archives. We wound up directly after our first trip to the archives, setting up a Wikipedia page, and Blaise set up the page. And almost immediately, he got a call from the New York Cultural Affairs Department. They had been a co-sponsor of the Cultural Council Foundation project, but they had forgotten. They had lost all of their files. So we immediately set up a meeting with the then Commissioner, Tom Finkelpearl, and we presented him a copy of that red book that you've seen, right? And we wound up being, CETA wound up being used as a case study in Mayor de Blasio's 2017 cultural plan for New York. But had we not done that, nothing would have happened. So the CETA Arts Legacy Project was now underway. Larry Raccioppo, you saw him in the archives photo, made contact with Molly at City Lore, and in 2018, City Lore hosted a CETA Artist Reunion, and here we are. In 2019, we began presenting at conferences at the College Art Association. We had one held at the Hilton, and another one at Hunter College as part of the conference, because we found out that the chair of the art department had been a CETA artist, another one. Then came 2020, the lockdown, all right? We couldn't do anything in person. We're on our computers, our laptops, sitting at home, and we start searching out people nationally. And that's when we tracked down John Kreidler, right, and a bunch of other people. And this was our very first Zoom, so I'll just quickly go through. Upper left, George Cook, who ran the DC, Arts DC CETA project, Blaise and me, Ted Berger, who we mentioned, who was instrumental in doing the New York project. There's John. There's Arlene Goldbard, who is a longtime cultural activist and proponent of CETA and a former CETA artist. There's Molly in front of her City Lore sign. And on the bottom is Deborah Cullinan, who's going to be presenting after us. We also mounted a campaign to contact newspapers and arts writers, because during the pandemic, people kept calling for a new WPA, and many of the writers said that was the last time the federal government supported artists and created artist jobs. So we wound up, actually, I'm rushing here, the first article that we had of any importance was in the art newspaper. And then in December of 2020, Blaise and I had an article in Hyperallergic, and this one really got wide distribution. And then we started expanding the website. We included an area for resources for moving forward. And this is the most important thing that I wanted to get to. We started putting together an online archive. This is open access. Anybody can get to it. It's hosted by the college that I taught, Franklin and Marshall, and it has articles, it's got documents, it's got movies, it has Zooms with artists. Here's one, a screenshot of a Zoom with Senga Nenguti and Maren Hassinger. And then post-vaccination, we started going to conferences again. So we did a conference, a panel 2 years ago at the College Art Association in New York called Art History in Search of a Historian.
And that's where we met Mary.
Right, that's where we met Mary. And I wanted to include this picture because the conference required everybody be vaccinated and have negative COVID tests. So we set up rapid art history testing, no appointment needed, CETA 1970s testing today, newly discovered variant in federal funding. And everybody except one failed, and we wrote prescriptions to people to come to our panel. After things opened up, we were back in the archives, and there is Molly and me going through the photos that we finally found. They were in a different warehouse, and Blaise was frantically scanning, and this is what wound up in the show that Molly and Jody hosted in their 2 venues. And we finally got to meet a lot of people in person, so here I am with Jody and George Cook. And, of course, John came. And I'm going to stop there. I had a little more to say, but if you go to the website, you can learn a lot more, and there are cards on the back table.